So, anyone here ever feel like you hit the wall at some point? Yeah, a few of us. Few of us along the way. Hitting the wall, it's a phenomenon particularly that we know from marathon running, typically happens somewhere around mile 20. And that is when the normal fuel that our bodies use for running, and obviously I'm not a runner, but the normal fuel our bodies use for running runs out, no pun intended, and our bodies start burning fat. And we feel that, our runners feel that. And when that happens, you either have to give up or you have to push through. And if you give up, of course, that's the end. Now, I'm not a runner, but I have to say that last week I felt like I hit the wall in a number of ways, particularly in terms of preparing a message for this morning. I had studied the text, I had outlined the message, I had thought through it carefully, but as I worked to finish it, frankly, I felt a little bit like Paul when he was trying to go to Asia. It just wasn't going to happen. And the Spirit kept putting up barriers. And I mulled over a number of things, including maybe a different approach to the passage that I expected to deal with. Again, it was a no-go. And for some reason, I don't know why, I'm trusting that it was God. My mind went back to the message that I preached here at Maple Grove almost exactly 3 years ago. And I went back and I looked through it and I thought, it was a good word then, or at least I think it was a good word then. And it might not be a bad word for today to repeat with a few little modifications. And so if you are a note taker, the bulletin's going to do you no good. You can, don't create airplanes. You can do something else with it, but don't use it for airplanes, at least not in here. But I'm going to, rather than turning to Ephesians 4, I'm going to invite you to just listen as I read some verses from Hebrews chapter 11. I'm going to read verses 1 and 2, and then verses 39 and 40. The writer says this: "Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for." And then verse 39. "Those were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect." In his book, Surprised by Hope, N.T. Wright observed that all language about the future is simply a set of signposts pointing into a fog. From these 4 verses in particular in Hebrews 11, which you might think of as kind of bookends to the chapter, there are 4 words that emerged to me 3 years ago, which seem every bit as relevant today as they did then. 4 words that I think capture the trajectory not only of the book of Hebrews itself, but for the entire biblical narrative. Words that can function, if you will, as signposts for us, both in our own life, but also as a church. The first of those is intentionality. Now, if you know me, you know that something I've prided myself on over the years and something I've striven to be in my time here at Maple Grove is intentional, to be a good planner. I believe that old adage that if you fail to plan, you should plan to fail. But I will admit that for a good part of the 3 years that I've been here, I've not always felt like we've been able to plan as carefully or as thoroughly as I would have hoped or expected, and that simply reflects the circumstances that we were in when I arrived. At least we haven't been able to plan that well as extensively for the long term. There have been times, there's still times, this might sound familiar to you for any number of reasons, not necessarily about church, that I've resonated with Steve Forbes' description of running a presidential campaign. He described running for president kind of like driving the train while you're still building the tracks. Or some of you heard the analogy, building the plane while you're trying to fly it. And that is the way sometimes it has felt. Now, I'm not complaining about that, I'm just simply making an observation. Now, sometimes people think that God is driving the train and building the tracks at the same time, that he's kind of making it up as he goes. So, for instance, we do something or someone else does something and God all of a sudden, I have to do something about that. And so he responds, and then somebody else does something and God has to respond again, and it goes back and forth like that. There are folks that think that that's basically how God operates. But that is not the picture we get in the Bible. It is not the picture we get in Hebrews. Verse 1. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. Then starting in verse 3, with creation, as chapter 11 unfolds, the writer traces out this very deliberate progression of people and events, which culminates then in verse 40, where he says that God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Thinking about ourselves, we are not where we are as individuals or as a church by accident. God knows exactly what he's doing. He always has. He has a progression that he is working out. He has a purpose. I've mentioned before Stephen Paulson, who's a Lutheran theologian, and he says that God has a destination he is headed for. Now, he doesn't deny free will. He doesn't deny our human choices. But he simply reflects on passages like Hebrews 11, Revelation 21, and Proverbs 19:21, where Solomon says, "Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails." We are here today as part of a purposeful design, an unfolding plan that is moving toward a God-ordained end, and that is the realization of God's redemptive purposes in Christ for the world, including right here in Maple Grove and in the Northwest Metro. God is very intentional about what he's doing. And he has brought us to this point in light of that. Second signpost, continuity. Now, this is a note on which the entire book of Hebrews opens, actually. The book starts this way. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. In that verse, we see both intentionality and continuity. You probably heard Hebrews 11 referred to along the way as a sort of spiritual hall of fame. I actually think it's better to think of it as kind of a spiritual family portrait gallery. It's a place where we can go to remember many of the people who have gone ahead of us and who have gotten us to where we are. In Hebrews, that mentions people like Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Rahab. Now, some of those names are familiar. Others of the names in the chapter are not as familiar. Some are truly heroic role models. Others maybe not quite so much. But every one of them warts and all, every one of them is part of God moving his purposes along through a chain of faithful people. And that chain stretches from the very start of human history down to us, and it will extend through us onward toward the return of Christ and the new heaven and the new earth that God promises in Revelation 21. Think about Maple Grove Covenant. We have our own kind of unique chain of faithful people, to use that term. Starts with a number of you whose names, I didn't bring it in, but whose names are on the church charter that was signed in 1987. Hangs in the office. If you ever go in the office, you'll see the church charter there. A number of you were part of that. Since that day, there are others who have been a part. They have come and they have gone, but they have been part of that chain of faithful people, and there will be more faithful people, I trust, who will add to the chain going forward. One of the things that we see not only here in Hebrews 11, but we see elsewhere is this solidarity among all believers in all places and all times in terms of God's unfolding purposes for the world. It might be Rahab, it might be Samuel, it might be the first readers of Hebrews, it might be us here today, it might be people who have not been born yet. But there is a solidarity and a unity among God's people in all times and all places. And when we get to verses 39 and 40, we even sense that in that solidarity there's a mutual dependency. We are dependent on those who have gone ahead of us, and those who come after are dependent or will be dependent on us. And so it is incumbent on us to not only serve well for the present, but for the future. Now, there's even a dependency, Hebrews says, by the people who have been long gone, the heroes of Hebrews. They are even to a great degree or in some degree dependent on us and those who will follow. God had planned something better for us so that only together with us would they be made perfect. That brings the third signpost, perfection. Verses 39 and 40 again, these were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. Since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. When you hear that word perfect, what comes to mind? One dictionary defines perfect as flawless or supremely excellent. Now, that is certainly part of God's plan for us, and giving just a little bit of a nod to the passage I was going to look at today from Ephesians 4. Paul writes that God's purpose for us is that we become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. And that's not only true for us individually, but for us as a church, that God's purpose is that we become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. That is one understanding of perfection, but that is not what the writer has in mind here. How many of us have built a house or remodeled a house? Few of us. Good experience, bad experience, traumatic experience, all of the above. We've done both. And every time that we have done a project, whether it's a remodel or a build, which we did a number of years ago, every time we've done a project, there have been a lot of people who have come along at different points during the time that we've been working. Some of those folks laid foundations or poured footings. Some of them framed out walls. After the walls were framed out, the drywallers came and closed those walls in, but they didn't do that until the plumbers and the electricians had come to do their rough-in work. Eventually, finished carpenters and painters and some others put the final touches on things. But every group of workers, every kind of craftsman who's been a part of the project depended on the other groups of workers, and the project was never finished until everything had been done, till the last detail had been attended to. And when the writer of Hebrews is talking about perfection here, that's what he's thinking about. He's thinking about completion. God has a destination he's headed for. He has a project to finish, including right here in Maple Grove. Revelation describes it in terms of a new heaven and a new earth where God is fully present, where every tear is finally wiped away, where death, mourning, crying, pain are all gone forever. And no matter how many years pass for us or for those who will follow us, no matter how many years pass, our job isn't finished until that God-ordained reality comes to fruition. Pursuing that reality is why we are here. It is why we have always been here. It is why we must always be here. That's why the go comes first in Go, Love, Live. Which brings us to a fourth signpost, perseverance. If we go back to Hebrews 11:1, the writer says this, "Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for." When the writer speaks here of hope, he's not talking about wishful thinking. He's talking about absolute confidence in God's future actions. Absolute confidence in God's future actions. That's what he means by hope. Verses 1 and 2 and 39 and 40 are, as I said, they're kind of the bookends to the chapter, but think about the whole chapter for a moment and what comes in. Some of you are probably quite familiar with it, as it lists these heroes of the faith. In many ways, it's kind of a bridge. The chapter is kind of a bridge between chapter 10 and chapter 12. Chapter 10 ends with an encouragement to persevere or to not shrink back, to hang in there for the long haul. Chapter 12 then opens with some very familiar verses, probably what has to be one of the greatest pep talks of all time. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. You see all that God has done to get us to this point. Hang in there, keep going. In between chapter 10 and chapter 11 is this portrait gallery of godly people who have not shrunk back, who have persevered. You can't win a marathon if you don't have perseverance. We will never see God's ultimate purposes for us in Maple Grove Covenant if we don't have perseverance, if we don't press on. If you read through the list of people in Hebrews 11, you come across some who were obviously great successes. People who saw God do great things. But you also see others who were tortured, who were jeered, who were flogged, who were imprisoned, people who became destitute, were persecuted and killed. But all of them, the writer says, all of them were commended for their faith. All of them were rewarded for their absolute confidence in everything God was doing in them and through them and around them. These were people who could only, in a very dim way, see the promise of the coming of Christ and his return. And yet they knew that God had something better, something greater, and something that was so real that they couldn't help but press on. They couldn't help but press on, even when, from a human standpoint, it didn't make any sense. Now, I'm not saying here that it makes no sense for us to press on, or that I'm worried about us not pressing on. I'm simply saying that for us to see what God ultimately has for us and through us, we need to stick with it. What does any of that have to do with us today? And this is true, again, this is true in our own lives, not just in terms of the church. There are times that in our own lives we come to a point where we might be ready to give up. We might be ready to say, I've done all I can do, or all I want to do, in any number of ways. And I would argue that the writer of Hebrews says, don't give up. Press on, because God knows what he's doing. All right, so thinking ahead, let me come back to restate something that I said 3 years ago. And that is that I am convinced that our future continues to be bright because God is in it. Now, 3 years ago, I said that I would not stand here and say precisely what that future would look like. That would have been presumptuous. It would still be presumptuous today. Verse 8 of the chapter reminds us that even Abraham didn't know where he was going when he left home. God just told him to take off, and he did. Brings us back to that statement by N.T. Wright, all language about the future is simply a set of signposts pointing into a fog. For those of us who have been around for a while, I think some of the fog has cleared, but there is the much that remains, and it will always be there because we are always called to live by faith, not by sight. And God always has something for us that he hasn't fully shown us yet, and that's okay. I want to close with 3 reminders that I ended with before. And I'm going to add one more, this one from Ephesians 4. We'll get to that in a moment. First of all, we have to continue to honor what God has already done. For those of you who've been here for 37 years since Maple Grove Covenant began, you've seen God do good things. For those of us who have been here a shorter period of time, I trust that we continue to see God do good things. And whatever he does in the future is going to build on what he has already done in the past. That's just the way he works. Second, we have to continue to trust. And again, this is true for us in our individual lives as well as in the church. We have to continue to trust. The word faith occurs more than 24 times in this chapter, in chapter 11. 24 times. It's kind of important. Now, the word faith can suggest a number of things, but in this context, faith is a willingness to trust God and to trust him wholeheartedly. That's what those heroes in Hebrews 11 did. And verse 6 tells us that without faith, it is impossible to please God. And I'm convinced that everybody here who's a part of Maple Grove Covenant really does want to please God. So we need to continue to trust him. We also have to remember that God's purposes have a glorious end. One of the hard things in life, not just again in the church, but even in our individual lives and our family lives, sometimes we can get so overwhelmed by kind of what's happening in the moment that we forget what's ahead. We can easily become overwhelmed by what's happening at the time. But someone reflecting on verse 40 said this, that God has so arranged things that the full blaze of his glory will not be revealed until all of God's people can experience it together. God's purposes for us, even those of us who are here today, God's purposes for us will not be fully seen. They will not be complete until all the folks who follow us have the opportunity to join with us, which is another reason we just have to press on, even when it's hard. Which brings us to Ephesians 4. Verse 16, part of the passage that I was intending to look at today, says this, that the church grows when each part does its work. Thinking back to that building analogy, if any one of those workers, any one of those groups of workers isn't engaged, doesn't work, the project can't go forward, or at least it might not go forward very well. As we lean into the fall, and in the fall we're going to launch into looking at the third of those words in our slogan, live in freedom and community, with an emphasis on community. As we lean into that, being the people that God has created us to be at Maple Grove Covenant as a body, my hope is that we will all be fully engaged in worship, in prayer, in serving, and in giving. Now, I will be honest and I'll be upfront, that isn't always easy. It isn't always convenient. We like things to be easy and convenient. That's not the way life is, and just ask any of those people in Hebrews 11. Following Jesus isn't always easy or convenient. But their willingness to pursue what God had put in front of them to do the work he had given them, enabled them to be commended for their faith and for their lasting impact. And my prayer is that as we continue into the future and as we look toward the fall and beyond, that we will see God commending us for our faith and our endurance. So, repeating a line from 3 years ago, let the adventure continue. Borrowing from Paul's words to Timothy, let's finish the race. Let's keep the faith, not for us alone, but for God's glory and neighbor's good. Amen? I invite you to stand as we sing.